As quilters, we all have our favorite pre-cut. For me, it's fat quarters. I love them and I collect them and I can't get enough of them. I use them in my quilt tops. I use them in my quilt backs, my quilt binding, and that's what I want to share with you today. I'm Lea Louise from Inspired Quilting by Lea Louise, and I want to show you some of the great tips and ideas I have about using your fat quarters as your quilt binding. Let's go. I can't wait to get started. I have an adorable little baby quilt that I want to finish up. It's been quilted. I have the backing all set, and I did some quick and easy diagonal straight quilting. And let's see, that's at just about 1.5 inches apart. And that worked out well because what I did is go corner to corner. And I find going corner to corner, it's an easy visual and it keeps me on track and nice and straight. So if you're looking for a quick quilting method, this is one that can really work good for you. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the fabric in the quilt. Low volume fabrics are generally a neutral background with a subdued print. And while not all of these look subdued, because they're all in a similar background, they really blend well together. In this particular quilt, the low volume isn't just the background, it's also part of the quilt design, so I wanted a lot of patterns. And you'll see, like here we have some yellow stars and some multi-dot colors, and so there's a lot of colors mixed in with the low volume fabrics, but they are predominantly sort of beigey white gray with darker print on top. Sometimes it's a graphic like a dot, musical notes, it can be text, it can be graphics. So low volume fabrics are great to work with, and there's a lot of fun things you can do. And we'll talk more about that another time. But right now what I want to do is bind this quilt. So this is a 36 patch. That means the blocks are 6 patches by 6. And each block starts at 2.5 inches. What I do is I select a number of batiks, anywhere from say 5 to 9 individual squares. The number's up to you, but that's kind of what I found worked well for me. And again, odd numbers usually work, except when they don't, and you find a pattern with an even number that works great, and that's fine too. So it's all about what you prefer and what you like. So you lay out your 36 squares, you put in some bright colors. I used batiks, and these were leftovers. You can see some of these are actually pieced from previous quilts. So these are predominantly all scraps that I had, and they work beautifully in a quilt like this. It adds a little bit more color and a lot more interest to each particular layout. So what I want to do is just show you the other half. This quilt measures 36 by 48. And you can see I chose different colors for each group, for each block. And that just keeps it really interesting. You can do it monochromatic. There's so much you can do. And this is a free pattern that is available down below. If you find down in the descriptions, you'll find a link that'll take you to the free pattern. It's a PDF, and then you can just download it and make your own. It has all the instructions as well as a grid to lay out each block. So what's fun about this is binding a quilt with lots of color really opens up an opportunity. And what I want to talk mostly about today is binding. A quilt this size will usually take about a fat quarter or a quarter of a yard. And because I use so many fat quarters in my quilting, I generally rely on a fat quarter to get my binding. Now, I found a couple that I thought would be fun. I liked this idea because it's the gray and white. It works really well with the background. There are some chevrons with this stripe in it, both in a large and a smaller scale. And you know, the binding I think would be kind of fun in this kind of a in this print. And of course I would do it this way. I love to have my stripes going horizontally because they stand out so much more on your binding. So let's say this is your quilt edge. Just do it this way. And then there's your binding right there. I just think that looks really fun. It adds a lot of interest to the quilt, especially since there's so much graphic design in here. This just really plays off of that. The other one I found is this blue, because there's a lot of blue in here, even like in the pinks and in the yellows. So blue's another great option that could work. And this is a really tiny blue and white stripe. And, you know, even something like that would work well. And it'll bring out the blues throughout the quilt, and that would look nice too. But I didn't choose either of these. I took these out just so I could show you some examples. And this is what prompted me actually to make this video, is I had this fabric, and look at that. It has absolutely everything. It has the blues, the greens, the light aquas, the yellows. So this is perfect for this, and it has the stripes that I like. What I'm going to show you is how to take your fat quarter and cut it into binding strips. So we have an 18 by approximately 22. It'll depend on the fabric that you buy. And I want to show you how to cut this in order to make your binding strip. I have my fat quarter laid out. I did a quick press. There's still a wrinkle or two in here, but I can take care of that as I'm sewing. You just want to take care of any big creases, you know, heavy creases that will affect the sewing, because sometimes when your fabric is creased heavily as you're sewing, you're not going to get a nice smooth stitch. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So the first thing we want to do in selecting our fabric is make sure it's a good match. So if you've done that already, as we already, you know, tried a couple different colors, and we selected the green stripe. I am going to show you on this because this one is already cut. But you want to make sure your fabric is going to work well with your quilt. And then what you need to think about is the size of your binding. Most bindings are just pre-cut at 2.5 inches. It's easy because that's a pre-cut that you can buy jelly rolls, or you can cut your fat quarters easily into yardage. I mean, 2.5 inch is a size that is commonly used. If you think you're going to have leftover, then maybe you want to stay with a 2.5 inch in order to have matching scraps, so to speak. If you're going to put a lot of strips together, you'd prefer to have them at the same size. Now, I have come to find that a 2.25 inch strip works really well for me. If you are using a regular quilt batting and a quilt sandwich with a front, a back, and some quilt batting in between, you can see I used low loft, so it's not particularly thick. So that extra 2.5 inch binding isn't really necessary for me on most of my quilts. Now, if I'm doing something with denim, blue jeans, wool, you know, something really heavy, then I'll go the full 2.5 inch, because that's going to give me the extra that I need to get around that thickness and come over to the top. So I sew my binding to the back, and then when I'm finished, I bring it around to the top. If that quilt sandwich is thick, then you need that extra bit of fabric in your binding to cover it and also meet the seam on the top of your quilt. So keep that in mind. I'm going to cut this at 2.25. No, you know what, actually I'll cut it at 2.5 because that is the most common. One thing to keep in mind too about those dimensions, if I cut this at 2.25, I'm going to get a total of 8 strips of binding. If I cut it at 2.5, I only get 7. So if you are kind of really close on your measurements and you need to make sure you get that extra 8th strip, then, you know, go ahead and do the 2.25. But like I said, I'll go ahead and do 2.5 because this I'm going to use for any number of different things. It may be binding, it may be strip piecing, whatever the case may be. But before we start cutting, we want to make sure we remove our selvage. And so just add your ruler to the edge, and the other thing you want to do is set your line even with this bottom. So set your line of your grid even with the line of your fabric, and that way you're going to get a good corner here. So when we sew our strips together, we know that they're square. Now sometimes it's easy to tell on binding where it starts and where it stops. For example, this one, where it's whiter. That white is more evident, and that's just because that's where it's sewn tighter. This is where the threads are woven a bit tighter in order to stabilize the edge of the quilt. Now let me show you here. This is one I wanted to show you. I had already trimmed this edge. Let's see, I've got to find the other edge. And everything was fine, but I noticed when I was trimming the other selvage, sometimes when you buy fabrics, you can get this sort of a frayed edge, and that's just the way they cut it. It's just kind of whatever that particular fabric company does. But what I want you to see here is, notice on these blue stripes, see how dark they are? And you notice on the back of the fabric, they're pretty dark. But notice here how much lighter, how much more white is in there. That's because the selvage extends down to that point. So if you were to just cut this ravelly edge off, you would be leaving that selvage. Now, why does that matter? Because this selvage is woven tighter than this fabric is. And like I said, that's in order to stabilize the edge of the fabric. And it isn't going to always sew the same way as the rest. Now, would this be a huge issue if you went ahead and made your binding? Probably not, because in this particular case, you don't really see the difference. You can see the edges where the sewing, where the weaving is actually tighter, and it can make some little ridges. But up close and personal, really no one's probably going to question that. But I go ahead, I take off that selvage just because it's a cleaner cut, and I know I'm going to get a nice good edge and a good seam, and it's going to be easier to add my binding to the quilt. So that's one thing to do when you're thinking about your selvages. So we know about how much we need. We're going to cut it at 2.5. And the other thing you can also do is, let's say you decide to go with a 2.5 and you need a couple more strips, but you don't have any more of this fabric. Consider putting two fabrics together. Now, it's a lot of fun to mix fabrics. Like, let's say you had this in 2 different colors, or you had something completely different. I'll put a link above on how to do binding with multiple fabric strips, with multiple fat quarters, because that one came out really, really fun. And so that's just another idea on how to use your fat quarters. You don't always have to have the exact same fabric for your binding around your entire quilt. Jazz it up a bit, make some fun, interesting decisions and design options that'll just be wonderful, that everybody will enjoy. So we're going to go ahead and cut this. Now, one thing to think about too is, once we get started, we're going to need to join all these layers. So I'm going to show you one of my things I do when I ever cut anything at 2.5 inches. First, I cut a 5-inch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember, measure twice, cut once. I'll cut a 5-inch, and then I'll come back to 2.5. I find the less I move my ruler, as in lifting it up and moving it, or moving the fabric, the better my results are going to be. So what I can do is just put my ruler here, and I just kind of go back and forth, make sure nothing's connected. Every once in a while I'll miss a little thread, and that's if you have a nick on your rotary blade, or if you have a spot like here on my mat. I cut at this point a lot, and sometimes I get a little divot in there, and the rotary won't always cut that thread. I got lucky this time. So I have these two. But you want to think about, when you're sewing, what thread you're going to use. And you want to find something that either matches it well, if that's important, or use a neutral. I will generally use a neutral to attach it to the quilt, and then I will find some kind of a fun, either bright color or variegated color, because that's going to add a lot of interest. Because I'm not going to just sew a straight stitch on this. Oh no, we're going to use one of our decorative stitches, because that just makes it all the more fun. All right, so I'm up to 4. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just cut 6 of them, and then that will leave me a nice wide piece on the end of my fat quarter that I can use for something else, whatever that may be. So I cut my 5-inch strip, and now I'm going to cut it back at 2.5. So that's all there is to it. Cutting it is not a difficult task at all. And it's just a matter of deciding which size, 2.5 or 2.25, and that you have enough. So when you're measuring your quilt, you want to measure all 4 sides and take that total. That total is going to tell you the distance or the length of binding that you need for your quilt, for your binding to go around your quilt. So we're going to start sewing these together. I want to show you real quick first how we're going to do that. So we have a matching thread or a neutral, whatever you like, and we're going to use a size 11 needle. For general quilting purposes, a size 11 is fine, and a moderately sized stitch, like maybe a 2.5. Sometimes 2, some folks like to go real small. Sometimes I find if I get too small a stitch, the fabric will almost like bunch in because the stitches are so close together, it just pulls it in too tight. And I don't like that. So I go maybe a 2, 2.5. Thicker fabric, I'll go to a 3. Now, we want these to lay diagonally. I want a diagonal seam, and I want to show you why. If I sew these end to end like this, so I'm going to put these together and then I'm going to fold it over. Now when I make this binding, I'm going to fold it over once, I'm going to sew it to my quilt, and I'm going to fold it over another time over to the front of my quilt, and then I'm going to sew all this. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, I have 8 layers of fabric right there. That's a big lump on the side of my quilt, and I do not want to do that because it's totally unnecessary. We are going to use a bias seam. Now, what I love about a bias seam is it's a smooth transition. It's going to allow the fabric, so what we're going to do is like this. So let me do it with a different color so you can see. All right. So if I were putting these two together, I would put it together like this. Now I'm going to show you when I'm sewing this on the machine. You want to leave a little overhang on each side. That makes sure that you're going to have enough seam allowance. You're going to tuck your needle in right there at that opening. See where that square is? And you're going to sew to this square. If it's easier for you, draw a line. Otherwise, just sew from corner to corner. And then when we do that, what I want you to see is how this seam now is spread out over the 2 inches. So when I fold this, notice how the seam is not on top of itself, and then I fold it over again, and this just blends across. So it spreads out that thickness of the seam, but look at how nice the fabric goes together. So if you're putting 2 colors together, instead of having a harsh seam that just, comes in straight side by side, you get this nice diagonal that sort of blends it together. So it's more of an aesthetic thing for me in that regard, although the thickness is really structurally something that is a strong consideration for me because I don't want to have that bulk along the edge of the quilt. So when we're ready to do our quilting and our diagonal pieces are sewn together as they are here, then we're going to take our binding and fold it in half. You can choose to press it at this point or not. I don't. And the reason, again, it's a minor point, but as you're sewing this, then you're going to fold it to the front. Now, think about when you fold something, and if you've ever noticed your seam allowance doesn't always measure exactly a 1/4 inch, it may be off by a thread or 2. Even though this fabric is thin, every time we fold it over, we are adjusting it by the amount of the fold. And it may only be 1 or 2 threads, but if I go ahead and press this, and then I fold it over and it comes up on top of the quilt, I may find that that press line doesn't exactly follow. where I want it to be. I may have a little extra fabric on the inside or the outside. I don't want to fuss with that. For me, I just sew this on like this. I can finger press it as I go because that's easily adjusted. And then when I come up on the top, I'm going to sew it and it's just going to fold really nice. Again, you decide what works for you. I'm telling you what I like to do because that's what works for me. And I find the more information we have, the better decision we can make for ourselves. Now, there is one other trick I want to show you. And when we're putting our seams together, like I showed you here, and we sew from corner to corner like this, right? Well, when I cut that 1/4 inch seam, I'm going to have some triangles left over. And you can see here, let me find a spot, where this one is sewn together. And so it's going to come apart. I don't worry about matching stripes, by the way. I love using them, but I don't fuss with matching. So, you know, if that's a thing for you, that's fine. Otherwise, don't even worry about it because you only see that 1/4 inch binding and it's very minimal. So we've got this. Now I cut these pieces off and I want to show you. They're just this small bit like this. Now, it's not a lot in and of itself, but for me, if you do a lot of quilts and therefore a lot of bindings, you have a lot of these little triangles. And these are great for doing little half square triangles. Even better if you're joining 2 fabrics to make your binding, just save them as they're sewed together. What I do is I'll sew this and then I'll sew a second seam so when I cut them, I have small little half square triangles that just need to be trimmed down. So save this extra fabric. These triangles are going to come in handy. Maybe you can use it in a border, maybe you can use it on the backing, or maybe your quilt label. Some fun ideas, but don't let this fabric go to waste. All right, it's time to move to the machine and get some of this finished, and then we'll get our binding ready to go and add it onto the quilt. Let's get some binding on the quilt. Now I have my pieces, my strips all sewn together. I did my 45 degree angle to connect them, and I trimmed off those triangles. And so now I have these beautiful strips. Now, oh, those almost matched. Like I said, I don't worry about matching them. If it happens, that's rather serendipitous because I don't put any effort into it. Because by the time we fold this and fold this, you really don't even see that. So let me go ahead and get this started. We'll start at this end. And before we do that, I want to show you what I do on the edges of my quilt. Before I do any binding, after my quilt is quilted, I go and do about an 1/8 inch seam or stay stitching or basting. I use a larger stitch, probably about a 4, so it's more like basting, but it just holds everything together. If you've ever done quilting or binding where you have kind of some extra pieces or they're loose, they're not sewn together, they can fold over, and then that becomes a problem and you have to tear it out and it gets caught and it gets messy. Oh my goodness. So I always do this and then I trim my quilt. So I do my basting, I trim my quilt, and then I'm good to go. And I'm showing off my new nippers. Aren't these awesome? Oh my goodness, I love it. They're like super spring-loaded. So it's really nice and easy on your hands, and they're weighty enough that they really feel like, you know, I've got something to grip on. But anyways, I'll put a link down below if you're looking for a pair. I just really love these. I've been looking for some for a while, and I'm just having fun clipping everything. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to start on the back of my quilt. I always start on the back, and then I wrap to the front. Now, that's contrary to what a lot of people do, and again, I'm showing you what I prefer, and I'll, you know, kind of explain the reasons along the way, but it really works for me. So let's get this started. I don't press, I just fold, and I place it in the center of one of the sides of the quilt. If I'm really, you know, being fussy, I'll put it at the center of the bottom of the quilt. But quite honestly, quilters are the only ones who know the top and bottom, unless it's directional. So most folks aren't going to be aware of what is the bottom or not. So just start in the center so you have room to make an adjustment for putting your ends together. And that's why we're in the center, because I want some extra space. So I'm going to lock in my stitch. And as I'm sewing, I fold this as I go, and I make sure it's even. Now, one quick tip that I find is whether I'm using a 2 1/4 like this or a 2 1/2, sometimes I find I might need a little more binding wrap than anticipated, or maybe I could only cut this, at a narrower width and I didn't quite have enough. If you sew this, and do you see how I'm offsetting that seam just a little bit? All this is going to be on the inside of your binding. So when it's wrapped over, you're not going to see any of this. There's not going to be any stress on this particular part of the fabric. So if this seam is narrower than your 1/4 inch, it's not going to pull out because it is not going anywhere. Now, I'm going to do mine evenly, but I have in the past used that trick because it gives me just a little bit more binding if this were particularly thick, or, I wanted to add extra something in here to make the binding be a bit poofier, whatever the case may be. It's just something good to know. The other thing as I'm sewing, oh my goodness, I forgot my walking foot. Oh, I have to put that on. I don't know how I forgot that. But before I do, this is going to be on top of my quilt back. And as I'm sewing, I'm going to hold it. Now, I'm not pulling or stretching it. I'm holding it taut. The reason being is I don't want more of my binding to feed in than the bottom, because then it gets a little ruffly. So as long as I keep this, I hold it between my finger and my thumb, and as I'm sewing, I just sort of hold it in place so that it's not a lot of loose. I keep it so it's laying flat as opposed to being loose like that, because then you can end up with more fabric in there that you want. But just hold it in place, and you can just hold your finger on it, whatever works for you. But let me go ahead and get my walking foot on. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot that. I'll be right back. I have my walking foot in place, and I'm just using a regular length stitch. I'm not changing that in any way. And I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as I said, I'm just going to fold this as I go. If it's easier, definitely go ahead and clip it. Sometimes if you just have 3 or 4 pins or clips, then you can move them as you're going around the quilt, or you can do the whole thing in advance. I just find that I tend to knock them out too often as I'm moving around. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew around here. When we get to our first corner, I'll show you how we make the turn. That's kind of the biggest learning curve. Once you understand how that works, you'll be binding lots of quilts before you know it. And it's not that it's difficult, it's just understanding what you're doing. So the first thing is you want to sew to within a 1/4 inch of this edge, and I'm going to put a pin right there. You can mark it, you can actually pin the binding, whatever works for you, but I'm just going to lay my binding down on top, and I'm going to continue sewing right up until I get to that pin. Remember, get your pin out before your needle hits it. And then just back tack a bit. And I'm going to cut my thread. Now at this point, you're going to turn your quilts, and we're going to go on the next side in a 90-degree direction. Now we can't just pull this. You notice how this all wants to go somewhere, so we're just going to naturally follow that. So if you're unsure of what you're doing initially, just pull this down and see, and it's going to show you what it wants to do. So the quick and easy way to do it is to pull it upward. So make sure this is nice and straight and flat, and you want this edge of your binding even with that edge of your quilt. So we have that, and then what we do is we fold this down. Now I leave just the littlest smidge beyond the seam allowance. Not a lot. I mean, I'm not putting it out where there's a large amount like that. I just want to have a little bit that allows a bit of flex in my fold so that I don't have it too tight. That way my miter will lay nice and smooth. All right, so I'm going to start right at the very beginning, and as I'm sewing here, I'm going to hit the 1/4 inch spot where I stopped. So this will be continuous, and that means that the binding will be completely attached. There won't be a loose corner or anything like that. So let's get that in there. We've got it started. And now I'm just going to go through to the other side, and we'll do another corner, and you're going to be surprised how quick this will go. I'm approaching corner number 2. I have my pin in place so I know right where I want to stop stitching, and it's right on that yellow line, which makes it easy. So I'll do a little back stitch to reinforce it, and I'm going to pull everything out. I'll cut those threads, and I'm going to turn my quilt. My seam is sewn all the way to the edge within a 1/4 inch of the back, or of the seam edge, the quilt edge. And I'm going to just kind of hold my finger here as I'm pulling this up so I know that I'm getting a good straight fold. And then I'm going to just pull this down so that it is just the slightest bit beyond. There we go, just like that. And go ahead and start stitching our 1/4 inch. Now one thing I noticed too, as we're coming around the corner, we are approaching one of the seams in the binding. And all I do is finger press the seam down, just like that. And if you've pressed it ahead of time, that's fine. You can also press it open, whatever works for you, whatever you're comfortable with. Again, this is your quilt. You set the rules. And I'm just kind of giving you a bit of guidance here. All right, let's work towards corner number 3. Here we are at corner 3. I'm going to sew right up to where my pin is, tack my stitch, and turn. My quilt is turned for the next corner, and I'm just going to fold this over so I know the binding is even. I'm going to put my finger here so as I pull it up, I can sort of control where I'm going. I'm going to stop right at that edge and just hold everything in place and pull it down. And I'm going to bring it just almost even, and we start on the, what are we, the 3rd corner. My goodness, we're just about finished. This has gone great. All right, let's keep going. We're almost there. We're at corner 4, getting ready to go around the last bend here. And just follow the same process. It really is simple going around the corner. Don't let it intimidate you. The biggest difference is simply that you're cutting and restarting, and that sort of seems like, oh no, I can make a mistake if I do it wrong. But there's only one way this is going to work. Like I said, if you just pull this in, that fold is going to create itself right there, and you go, oh yeah, that's what I need to do, is just pull this up this way and pull it down. And that just makes it nice and straight so that we get a beautiful mitered corner in our binding. Okay, there we are. So let me go ahead and sew this. Now, because we're on the last corner, that means we are going to be approaching our seam where we're going to join our binding. And I like to leave a good amount of binding fabric to allow plenty of space to turn my fabric, because remember, we have to turn this strip in order to make a 45-degree, there we go, a 45-degree seam. Now, there are a lot of different ways of ending your binding, and I guess I'm just kind of old school. I do things the way I always learned, and there are some new techniques that are quicker. One of the ones that I've seen is where you can, you know, sort of fold this down and over, and let's see, how does it go? It goes like, you do a 1/4 inch, maybe it goes this way, and then you fold this over, and then your binding comes down and goes in there. But see, this part isn't sewn. I don't like that loose part, and I know it's not going to come apart, but it's just one of those things. It's just something that I am not comfortable with. It's not a way that I've learned to do it, and not a way that I'm going to give it a try. So here's my open space with about a 10-inch gap between my two binding seams. I'm going to just tuck a pin in approximately in the middle. You don't have to measure, just sort of get it there. And I'm going to put the shorter of the two pieces to the bottom, and I'm just going to cut this right at that pin and just cut it straight across. So now I have a good little scrap piece that I can use. So this is going to go right here, and I'm just going to take my pin out to hold it in place. Now I'm going to take my other longer length of binding that I was sewing on, and I'm going to place it right over that lower piece, and you can see there's the end of my binding. Now I need to cut this binding 2.5 inches past where they cross each other. So what I'm going to do is take my little 2.5 inch ruler, and I'll just lay it here offset so you can see. I'm going to measure from here down here, and then that's where I'm going to cut it. So I'm just going to, let's see, I've got it right there. I'm going to cut it right here. I'm going to come in and I'm going to cut at that point. So that's how you measure the end of your binding, so that you know you have it in the right place. Then what we're going to do is unpin this. We are going to lay the top piece like that. So because you're right here with your quilt laying the top piece, it's going to lay very easily. Now the challenge, if you want to call it that, is that this lower piece needs to go on top at a 90-degree angle, making sure you don't twist anything. What I do is just let this quilt pull up a little bit. So you can see I have this piece at the 90 degrees where I want it, and I'm pulling this quilt side edge up a bit so that these ends are close together. That way I can turn this and place it where I want it. Now, if you don't leave at least that 10 or 12 inch space, that gap, you're going to be trying to pull this much tighter, and it can get difficult. At this point, I'm just going to sew from corner to corner, and it sometimes can be a bit easier to have a pin, and I'm not going to want these ends to overlap too much because the seam allowance is cut right where it needs to be. But what I want to be able to do is sew from this corner to this corner, and if it's easier, you can draw a line or you can fold it. And then I'm just going to start sewing. Take my pin. And there you have it. Now, before you cut anything, go ahead and trim your threads, but do not cut any fabric until you've done the test. And if it doesn't lay nice and smooth and fit snug against your quilt, something happened. So step back and take a look at it. What can sometimes happen is if you cut that 2.5 inch too much, then this is going to be bulky. This will be bulky and it's not going to want to lay flat. So you just need to pull it out and get your seam get your pieces cut to the right length. But you can see how straightforward it is. You just lay it and do the same 90 degrees that we did, or excuse me, the 45 degrees that we did before. And now this just, see how it just pulls right in place. It stays right where we need it. So I'm going to finger press my seam, and I'm going to finish attaching my binding. And then we're going to flip it over and sew the front of the binding to the, the front of the binding to the front of the quilt. So we are just about there. And this part probably takes longer than sewing the front on. It can be done more quickly than the way I do it, but when I do the front, I use a decorative stitch just because it makes it look nice. So a little bit past your previous seam, trim everything up, and now we're going to flip this over and we are going to bind our quilt with the final step, and it's going to look gorgeous. I can't wait to see it. I am all about using what I have on hand, whether it be fabric or thread. Now this is the thread I'm going to use on the top. I like using a variegated just because it adds a lot of interest, and it just looks good. It's nice because I'm using a decorative stitch, and it's just going to look pretty, and that's what I like. I'm going to use this on the back for the bobbin. The back of the quilt is much darker, so I can get away with the dark fabric. Now this is getting close to the end. I don't know how much thread I have here, but I do have another partial bobbin of this, and worst case, I switch to navy. It's okay. You don't have to have everything matchy-matchy, constant, perfect throughout your quilt. This is your quilt. Have fun making it. Check this out. I'm impressed with this little spool. It did not look like there was a lot of thread. I have a full bobbin here, plus 3 more full ones, and an almost full. That's a lot of thread. I'm really excited about that. Now this, I don't really talk threads very often. I use 100% cotton and quilting thread, and if that's what I have, then that's perfect. Now this is made by Selkie. I like their blends, their blendables, their variegated threads, because I really like the colors and they have such a great selection. I started using their threads when I was using metallics, and they have a great selection of metallic cords as well as braids that are a lot of fun to sew with, and I was doing applique and things like that. And so I've just gotten, used to this, and I buy one of these. You can see 500 yards. It lasts a long time, and this one's been around a while. I don't even live by Keepsake Quilting anymore. I used to go there all the time. But, it's a 30 weight, which is great. I think 40 is probably the most common. We used to always use 30, and then it switched to 40. And then a lot of times folks will use 50 for the quilt back, as far as in the bobbin. But 50 was originally for like applique and things of that nature, art quilts, because it's a lighter weight. And I still use my 30 and 40, I guess. I'm old school in a lot of different ways, and it works for me, and that's fine. But you can see it's a matte finish, so it's not a shiny thread. It's strong, machine or hand used, dry cleanable. So, but long staple cotton, which is really good because you want the long threads, not the short ones. And when they wind it, it's going to be sturdier and less apt to fray. Okay, that's enough on thread, but I was just excited to get that many bobbins. All right, let's get the quilt going. The binding was attached to the back, and now we're going to wrap it around to the front and sew it. Couple things. I always start at a corner. The reason being is when you come around this way, you want to have this part already sewn in place. Couple things that I want to show you. This seam is where the binding is attached. And when you fold this over, you can feel that ridge. So if you feel right here, you've got the extra fold of this binding. And you can feel that with your fingernail. Just putting your finger flat on there, you can feel it. So what I do when I turn my binding over is I make sure I come over that stitching and that I can feel that little groove right here. Because this is where I'm going to sew. I'm going to sew just inside, and that's not even 1/8 of an inch. It's quite narrow. But the secret to getting it narrow, close like that, and keep it straight is you find a spot on your presser foot that you can align your binding with. If you can just keep that aligned with the same spot on your presser foot, you're going to have a nice straight line. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Initially, it may be easier to put a couple pins in. So this first pin will go in line with the seam that's already there. Sometimes it's hard to go from the top and come back up, so I'll come from underneath and then just put my pin down into the fabric, and then that way it's going to hold it in place. So do that, and then put one down maybe a couple inches, and again, make sure you're right where you need to be. Let me show you one other tip too. As I'm doing my binding, I will finger press without turning it over. I just take my thumb and my finger like this, and I'll put my finger in that seam, and I just pull it down. And as I'm doing that, this is finger pressing the back. It's making that seam lay flat and giving the extra pressure of my thumb just make sure that everything lays right where I want it to be. So that is a way to keep your binding even so that it doesn't get floppy on the back side and a bit wishy-washy on the front. So you'll see as I'm going along that I'm often running my thumb and finger along that edge just to make sure everything's where it needs to be. And so I'm going to put this right here, and I'm going to feel where that edge is, and just do a visual to make sure that you're feeling the right part and everything is working well. And then I just pin this in place, and we're good to go. Now I am using a decorative stitch. It's a buttonhole stitch, or it's a blanket stitch. And what it's going to do is sew down a couple stitches and then in a couple stitches. It'll come down and in. I like the decorative nature of it, but I really love the fact that it's a strong stitch and it's going to hold this together for a long time. And I am going to start sewing right up here at the top of where the quilt edge is, and then I'm going to come down. Then when this piece at the very end, when I come around, I'll come and sew over that, and then I'll do a stitch here, and I'll show you that at the end. So get yourself pinned in place on the first one. I want to make sure I have my thread pulled through from the bottom, and now I can see that my needle, let me get my little pointer and I'll put there we go. Okay, my needle is going to come right here on this inside point of my presser foot. Can you see that right there? This is where my needle is going to be sewing, right at that point. So if I make sure that this part of my presser foot is just over the edge of this binding, I'm going to be inside that edge. Now you can take it even just a little bit more. It depends on how much room you have, but you want to stitch the top so that it's going to encase this stitching from the back. So we are going to be essentially attempting to stitch on top of that stitching. Now realistically, I'm going to be stitching just to the inside of it, and that's fine. But that's just kind of the goal, and I always make sure that this is pulled over enough that it covers this thread here, so that as I'm stitching along, I'm going to be sewing that. I don't want this to lift up and be able to see the thread underneath. It doesn't look finished that way. So I probably go to a little more effort than necessary, but that's one of my sticking points. That's something that I'm concerned about and determines the way I do this. So let's get everything in place. I'm lining this up, and you're going to be amazed. Actually, I can go over just a little bit more. There we go. How quickly this can go. So it's going to move forward, and I'm actually going to lengthen it a little bit. Let's take it up just a bit. There we go. And once we get through, I'll show you how the stitch looks. And all I need to do is keep a finger right here. And that just holds it in place. So I can, with this hand, I'm checking to make sure I'm over the seam. And with this one, I'm just holding my fabric in place. And I am not watching my needle. I am not watching my finger. I am watching the fabric right here. As long as you keep your eye right there, your fabric's going to be in the right place. Watching the needle does not give you any control because you have to guide the fabric to hit the needle at the right place. Now at this point, if you're more comfortable, you can add pins along the way, but what I do is I come through and I just pull this over and I tuck it across and line it up where I want it, and I just hold it as I go. Another thing you'll see me do as I'm quilting the binding is I'm holding with this hand. This hand I will sometimes hold behind just to kind of help move things along, but also to kind of lift the drag on this side. I'll sometimes put my arm here and sort of let it push the quilt, because if that's pulling, then you're going to be distorting your stitches and you're not going to get a nice line because the quilt is pulling. So a lot of times the other thing I'll do is I'll get my ironing board right next to my sewing table and adjust it so that it's in line with the table, and my quilt can just lay on top of that and it doesn't hang off the side of my machine. All right, let's get this going. So I'm ready. I'm lining my presser foot with the edge, and I have my seam right where I want it to be. And just let it go. And I always want to stop when I'm adjusting and pull everything through. Make sure I'm good. Line it up. Now let's take a look at the back. So I want you to see what the stitch looks like. And you see how it goes along and then it bumps in. So I think that makes it really sturdy. And you can see how I stitch right along the edge. Now, sometimes it's better than others, but hey, you know, I'm really happy with it. And the front, it just kind of goes along that edge pretty evenly, and that's what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch to the other end of this, and then I'll show you how we're going to take care of that corner as we go around. As I'm approaching the first corner, what I'm going to do is pin this in place, because I want to be able to come down along this corner, turn, and sew. And if this is already placed where it needs to be, it's going to make it much easier for me. So I just fold it over again, just so it's past the stitching line. And I'll put a pin not directly in line with where I'm sewing, but maybe half an inch out, because I don't want to run into that needle, into that pin with my needle. And then I'll put one more pin here, so after I turn the corner, I can sew a little bit and then get myself adjusted. Now, the other thing I do is, as I'm coming here, in order to get a good miter corner, you want this to fold over nicely, and you can just come down and do this, and sometimes you can get like where it squares on top. Can you see how that looks? Let me hold it up a little bit, where you can get this square instead of a corner. And so on the back side, see how this looks? See how we have that nice mitered corner right there? And this will all flatten out after when I press it and do that. But what I want to do here is I lay it down flat, and I take a stiletto, a pencil, a pin, whatever you use. My seam ripper works great. And I tuck this so that this little bit of fabric in the binding goes alongside that quilt. And what that does is it forms this nice point that's going to come in perfectly and sew together. So let me get a little bit closer. So as I'm approaching, I'm going to just take this point and tuck that fabric in. I'm actually going to push it down so this part will fold over it, Because if you don't do that, you get too much fabric, and this doesn't have any place to go. It just sort of hangs out there. So we want to tuck that inner corner. That's our miter, and tuck it to the inside. So if you've wrapped Christmas presents and you're doing the corners, this is not unlike that. And the reason I like using a stiletto is because then now I can hold this right in place, make sure I'm over my stitching line, and I can feel it in there. And I don't have to worry about sewing my finger because I'm using my stiletto. Whoa, got a little carried away there. I'm using my stiletto to work it. Now, did you notice that when I was coming through, this edge can sometimes want to flip up inside here because we're so close to the edge? Just stop, pump your presser foot, and a lot of times it'll just tuck right underneath. But right now, I'm coming right up to this corner, and I'm going to come to the corner and kind of just a little bit past it. Now, I'm going to turn this so that I can go along the next side, and I'm going to lift my needle and come over just a smidge. And that's just sort of like an overlock in order to hold everything together. And I'll take this pin out. I want to make sure that everything's right where it needs to be. And then I'm just going to start sewing right there. So by moving that needle over just the littlest bit, I'm locking the stitches in place. And it's just something that works for me. I think one of my biggest concerns about quilting is places coming undone. And so I do try to overstitch where possible, and that will, if I come into a seam and I overstitch it, then that will, help secure it. And that extra 1/8 inch that I do around the edge of my quilt before I put the binding on is another way to secure it. Secures these stitches here so that they're less apt to come undone and unravel. Plus it holds a nice clean edge to attach my binding to. So, there are a lot of extra steps you may or may not choose to take simply because it's reassurance to you, or you like it better, or it's what you're accustomed to. But remember, it's your quilt and you do what works for you. And so I'm okay doing it oh, I thought that was thread. That's part of the print. So yeah, go for it. Just have fun, and I'll meet you at the next corner. We're at the next corner, and I have my pins in place. I'm ready to come around. I'm going to place this into that bend right there, into that fold, and let this come over nice and smooth, and see how it lines up right there. I do want to make sure, I'm going to move this up just a little bit. It's not quite covering the stitching. And I want to make sure I don't come up short. And there we go. And then bring this one over. And when I pull this up, I wonder if I can show you this. I'm pulling from back here. I'm not pulling this folded edge because I want this to self-fold, and it will lay exactly where it needs to go. So just kind of let it fold into the corner, and it'll be nice and smooth. So I'm going to just use my stiletto, or like I said, I just use a seam ripper. Just be careful you don't poke a hole in your fabric. And so I come right up into that corner, I stitch over it, and I do one more, and then I come in one stitch. And then I turn the corner, I lift my needle, I move it over just a little bit, and it's going to lock itself in. And I'm going to pull this out before I have a catastrophe. All right, so now I'm just going to continue going around to the next corner, and it won't be long, and this quilt is completely finished. I do have a quilt label to put on. We'll have to do that later. But for now, let's go ahead and finish this binding. Here's corner number 3. I'm pinned. I'm ready to go. I'm going to tuck my little seam ripper right in there and see how everything lines up beautifully. We'll sew around this corner, and then we'll come into the last stretch. Alright, come around that curve there, lift it up, go over just a little bit. What I want to do is show you the back of the previous corner, because we didn't look at that. So you see that the front is folded over, and we have that nice little fold right there, and that's what you want. Now on the back side you have the same thing, but the fold goes in the opposite direction. And the reason that's important is that's what gives you this nice corner here. So we've got our stitching that comes from here to here and wraps around, and it holds everything in place. It's all encased, it's not going anywhere, and we are going to have a finished quilt here before you know it. So I'll meet you at the last corner and show you how we finish this off. We're down to the final corner, and this is where we started. So this is why we folded that over and we sewed it in place. So as we come around, all we need to do is tuck that little bit in and bring this over, and look at that, a beautiful mitered corner. I love it. Let me get that back in there. Let me show you. If you don't get it all the way down, here's another thing that can happen. See how it sort of comes up high again? It's not going at that nice angle. By tucking this in good and tight, you're going to get a much better corner. Okay, I know I've just said that over and over, but that's probably the most important thing about getting a mitered corner, is that little tuck. Now at this point, what I do is I turn my fabric, I turn my quilt, and I reset myself to a straight stitch. And then I line my needle up with this first line of stitching, and I'm going to just do a straight stitch, about 1 inch or 1.5 inches, and then that just sort of overlocks everything, and I don't have to worry about my threads coming loose, or the binding having a problem. And then there we go. Look at that. It all looks wonderful. I love it. So we have bound a quilt. It looks terrific, and I'm going to get a full-size photo so you can see what it looks like. Oh, so excited. I'm glad you were here to join me with this. Here's a look at the quilt with the finished quilt binding. I think it looks wonderful. Those stripes are a perfect match for this quilt. Don't forget to download the pattern. It's down in the links below the description. Here's a better look at the quilt binding against the back. I think that fabric is beautiful. It's so pretty, such a nice batik. I hope you enjoyed this and you have some ideas for some new quilt bindings, and maybe even try and make this pattern. It's wonderful. It's a lot of fun, and you can use any kinds of fabrics. These are just what I had on hand and I enjoyed. I'm going to have to do a tutorial on this. This is a fun pattern to make. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining me.